it's hard to understand poverty if you have never lived anywhere near poverty. It's hard to understand the exigencies of healthcare if you've never had to worry about whether you yourself have, maybe you're frustrated by, Blue Cross Blue Shield or whatever, because who isn't, but you've never had to contend with what it's like to actually not get healthcare.
That was what I was going to start with, because I read your piece several years ago about the potential tsunami / earthquake in Portland or in Oregon, and I feel like existential dread is something that you have thought about a lot as a result of that, and that's one of the feelings I think people have certainly experienced over the last 2 years. Because like when I read that piece, I took 2 lessons from it. One, don't live in Oregon, as beautiful as it might be. But then 2, that there are these massive sort of deliberately unexplored or under-considered existential risks to us as human beings, perhaps us as a species, climate change, pandemics, etc., that if one thinks too much about, you become paralyzed. But if you don't think about it all, you're incredibly vulnerable to. So how do you think about that?
Boy, it's a good question. I mean, it's kind of the big question. In some ways, being a journalist is helpful because on the one hand, there's like an absolute mandate that you do think about it, if you're going to write about this kind of stuff. And it gives you at least the illusion of feeling like you're doing something useful with your thoughts. They're not just keeping you up at 3 a.m., they're keeping you up at 3 a.m., but then you're putting them on the page. And hopefully maybe someone somewhere, bolts their house to the foundation and their family survives an earthquake or what have you. I have no illusions that we are nearly as powerful as we wish we were as journalists, but it's nice to feel like you're doing something. And, at the same time, I think it does kind of wards off despair, not only because you feel like you're actively working towards some ends, but also because on some practical level, you do have to go read and learn and think about something else. I guess I could have spent my life after that just like working on seismic safety issues, and I admire those who do. But for me, since that's not what I do, there is always something else to go think about, and life and the world are busy and full of things. So it's fun to go think about other things. But I am also, to be honest, just predisposed towards existential dread. So I think the deep answer is I'm just used to it.
Right. Yeah. Like I think the pandemic brought forth this phenomenon, which clearly existed before, but this idea of doom scrolling, like, hey, I'm going to pick up my phone. I tend to find like if I'm like waiting for my kids to fall asleep, and I'm just sort of stuck, they're like laying on me, or, I can't leave the room just yet, or I'll make noise on the floor and I'll wake them up. For whatever reason, there's a part of my brain that says this would be a good time to go make yourself profoundly unhappy and worried about what is happening in the world. And I feel like, whether it's thinking about a tsunami that could wipe out, a good part of the Northern Pacific, or climate change or whatever, we have this tendency to just sort of fixate on these massive dangers over which we have very little control. And it's almost like a form of torture / entertainment.
Yeah, I mean, I have tried really hard over the last several years to make a habit of not lying awake worrying or sitting around at midday worrying without just getting up and doing something. This is not actually entirely practical all the time, and I'm certainly not good at it all the time. But at some point, in 2016, when I did my father had just died, the world in general seemed like it was careening off in terrifying directions, and my propensity to lie awake worrying was also careening off in terrifying directions. And I just thought, I can't do this to myself. It's useless to the world. It's destructive to me. This is a silly way of coping. And so I try hard to do something. And sometimes that feels like something practical, go actually help someone, use my money or my resources or my mind or whatever I can to be useful in the world. And sometimes it's just acknowledging that there is nothing useful to be done in that moment, including worrying, and that I would be much better served by going and reading a novel or whatever I can do to kind of center myself in the things I actually cherish about humanity and cherish about the world, and kind of refresh myself that way and start over.
Yeah. And then it's like there's the propensity to doom scroll, and which is obviously impotent and doesn't do that much. And then I definitely have seen during COVID, there's another part of society that decides, well, because that makes me uncomfortable and would be unpleasant, I'm not only not going to think about it, I'm going to deny that it exists altogether, and almost create a religion around rejecting this uncomfortable truth that journalists or scientists or whomever, who have very little agenda or motivation to make it up, just accuse them of making it up, which I haven't quite figured that out either.
Yeah, I mean, you and me both. I wish I had the novelistic abilities ascribed to, the quote mainstream media. I wish I had invented this vast, complicated web of conspiracies to control the world, but I'm not that creative. And like most of us, I just look around and try to learn from experts and figure out what's really going on. But yeah, I mean, denial is a really interesting thing, right? It's obviously a very deep psychological response, and it obviously operates at every level, from the personal to the collective and the political. And it is a little shocking to live in an era where I feel like it is taking on incredibly broad scale communal and political shape. Not that it doesn't always exist there to some extent, but I think if you'd asked me 15 years ago to talk about denial, I would have thought about primarily the kind of personal experiences of it, a reaction to grief or to sudden bad news, or just unwillingness.
Or maybe
to
the Holocaust denial. That was like the one
Holocaust
area.
Denial. Yes. Right. Sure. And yes, I do feel like since then we've just, the Sandy Hook denial undid me, and we live in an era of so much right now, people who don't believe in the vaccines, people who don't believe in climate change, people who believe the election was stolen. I mean, it could go on and on. There's kind of no baseline empirical fact that someone isn't prepared to stand up and say that's not true. And it's very difficult to live in a world that looks like that, and it's hard to extend charity towards others, which I do try very hard to do. When you feel like, are we on the same planet here?
Back in the ancient world, philosophy wasn't abstract, it wasn't theoretical, it was designed to help you live the best life. In Stoicism 101, we have a 2-week course that will introduce you into philosophy, that will make you a better person. There's interviews with me, daily lessons that will challenge you to be better, give you new ways of thinking, tackling the problems of life, becoming your best self. As Marcus Aurelius says, you could be good today, but instead you choose tomorrow. Epictetus says, how much longer are you going to wait to demand the best for yourself? Check out our new course, Stoicism 101, at dailystoic.com/101. Yeah. No, it's weird too, because the ones you just mentioned, I'm not sure if this was true in the past, but it tended to be, there were a handful of disparate conspiracy theories. Maybe you have someone who's a Holocaust denier, then you have someone over here who doesn't believe the moon landing or whatever. But like the ones you just mentioned, they seem to all be the same percentage of, like, that is like a through line. Like I just read a piece, and it was specifically about the anti-vax movement, but it was basically that it's too big to fail at this point. Like it's not such a fringe group that it can be written off. It's having to be absorbed. Like when there's that many people who are into it, inevitably, politically, culturally, etc., people will have to start to cater to it, because it almost has a gravitational pull, because it's so many people. And it is strange how that denialism has become just almost a subculture of just like people who just reject information that is uncomfortable or in some way indicting of the status quo. You know what I mean? I think that's what they all have in common, is that to like, if you accept them, it creates either the need for moral outrage or, change, like lifestyle change or political change. But if you reject them, then you just get to keep being who you are, and you don't have to do anything.
Yeah, which, I'm terrified by the notion that suddenly, we will start to see more and more people cater to what should by rights be fringe beliefs. I mean, we're obviously already seeing it, right? I mean, plenty of people who know better are endorsing absolutely wrong-headed and dangerous notions about, the last presidential election, about the vaccines, et cetera. And yeah, it's hard to see the good way out of that, because I don't think we can just cede reality or cede our moral responsibility toward one another in the kind of craven name of, well, there's so many of them, we can't just confront them head on, or we'll lose their money, or we'll lose their votes, or we'll lose their respect, or what have you. And I sort of feel like, well, we have none of those right now. What is it you think you have to lose? That should not be the starting position. The starting position should be, we actively advocate for what we believe in.
Yeah, right. And that having to state and restate basic facts, that this is somehow like a transgressive or even political act, right? So like I can already predict emails that I will get for this little conversation we're having, where people are like, why did you have to get political? Why did you have to talk that? But which is inherently not a political act. Like there is such a thing as information and data and fact. And it has come to this place where, like, that writing, hey, I think Oregon is at risk of being wiped out in an earthquake is somehow like an activist position, right? Or something, right? Like it feels, because by writing about it, you're essentially prompting people to do a thing. Like the conclusion is so obvious based on the information you're providing. And yet people really seem to just reject the idea of being prodded or it be implied that they should have to do or change or accept anything.
Well, I'm very pleased to say I have not yet encountered, a large battalion of like tsunami truthers who don't believe this is going to happen. But I certainly take the broader point, which is it's very, very hard to get people to change their mind, and I think actually one of the difficult jobs that all of us should be confronting is figuring out how to do a better job of that, because I don't really see that we have a choice at this point.
No, I have your first book in hardcover, which I read when it came out. I loved it so much. I pulled it off the shelf and I could see all the notes that I took when I read it. I thought it was so great because it's a tricky thing, right? Like even what we're talking about, the idea of doubt or asking questions is so essential. And yet it's almost as if those very critical things have been sort of weaponized or used against. Like certainty, as you say in the book, is very, very dangerous. And so when people are just asking questions or proposing alternative whatever, that feels like it's in line with getting towards truth. And so it should be a good thing. And yet it's somehow leading us not closer to being right, but closer to being wrong about more things.
I mean, believe me, Ryan, I have thought often and hard about what this book would look like if I had written it 10 years later. And I think the short answer is I probably wouldn't have.
You wouldn't have written it at all, you think? Because it's too unstable a ground?
I mean, who knows, right? But I certainly, on the one hand, look, I absolutely stand by what I wrote in that book. And I believe very deeply in epistemological humility, right? And in doubt as a very healthy kind of posture towards the world, and for that matter, the cosmos. And I believe, as I said a moment ago, I believe in trying to extend charity to people with whom I disagree. So the kind of core tenets of this book still feel right to me, and they still feel like me. On the other hand, you're absolutely right that I watched them get weaponized, and I watched the position of that kind of humility and of extending charity start to feel, I think, in the culture at large, but certainly within me, a little less and less tenable, if not intellectually, then certainly politically. There is a larger list today of things I'm confident that I'm right about and other people are wrong about than there was, when I wrote that book. And I don't think that's because I've become more arrogant over that time. I think it's because of what you and I were just describing, this increasing disconnect between reality and rhetoric, the increasing number of people who have been persuaded to abandon actually all the other tools I advocate for in this book, research, reason, science, empiricism, the deep humility, not the shallow one of like, well, I'm just wondering about things, the deep doubt of, is this really how the world works? Not just the kind of doubt kind of cynically strewn by politicians. And I don't know that I could advocate for, I'm sure I could, but I don't know that I would have spent 4 years of my life, let's say the last 4 years of my life, thinking about how to make peace with my own fallibility and the likelihood that I'm wrong in an atmosphere, as important as I think that project is, in an atmosphere when a great number of people are telling me I'm wrong about things I'm to be honest, quite confident I'm not wrong about. And nor are you, and nor are most of us, who believe in ways of getting to the root of things.
Well, that's what I think is interesting about it, is that like you're talking about, there's more things you're certain about than you were in the past. It's almost as if, because generally, let's say the Overton window was different, or just like the stakes of the discussions were lower. It's like you didn't need to have an opinion on the thing. You didn't need to get to a place of certainty, because generally reality had sort of coalesced around those things. And now that people are questioning the very fabric of them, it's like, how strong did your beliefs in liberal democracy need to be when everyone is more or less agreed that liberal democracy is a good thing? Mm-hmm. And then when people start to undermine the foundations of that thing, it forces you to go, hey, this is important. We can't take this for granted. So I wonder if part of it is just, we could be a little bit more epistemologically loose and flexible when we were all roughly on the same page. Now we're not even reading the same book.
Sure. Yeah. And I don't want to pretend that there was some kind of, harmonious past where we, in any kind of broad sense, we all were on the same page. And yet I certainly share, your sense that somehow what was a kind of tenuous center holding has now is kind of spiraling dangerously toward collapse. And yes, in that context, it's not that appealing to me to expend my intellectual energy contemplating what if all my core beliefs are wrong. Actually, no, I do believe in democracy. And I believe that the fundament of democracy is that every single person has an unimpeded right to vote. You're not going to talk me out of that position. And in fact, I will, very clearly state that I can't imagine a more important position to articulate again and again in no uncertain terms these days. So yes, it's not, we are no longer, I think, living in an atmosphere conducive to the kind of caution and humility with respect to all of our beliefs that I endorse in the book, which again, isn't to say that I think that the tragedy to me is I actually do think those are good postures. And I wish we lived in a moment when we could all inhabit them, because I think you're right to suggest that it's a sign of a healthy culture, right? It's a sign of people able to agree sufficiently that disagreement feels productive and healthy and fruitful.
Well, there's that aphorism about sort of strong opinions loosely held, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that works in an environment where people are operating with good faith. The problem with your opinion being loosely held in a time of propaganda or gaslighting or outright sort of subversion and, let's call it anti-democratic or anti-scientific thought, is they are attempting to manipulate or attack the fact that they know you could change your mind, right? Mm-hmm. And so like what gaslighting does is exploit your very sort of good graces, right? That's like the really tricky part about it. Like, I think about this, like where people go, I'm just asking questions, right? Mm-hmm, and sure. It's like, yes, but are you asking questions because you want to get an answer, or are you just asking questions because you're trying to sow uncertainty? And so that trick, that it's like, how do you respond to someone attempting to sow uncertainty, if not by becoming a little bit more certain about the sort of first principles on which your life or society needs to be based?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I guess listening to you, I'm realizing that actually my feelings about that book are slightly more complicated than I just suggested, because of course the effect of feeling more certain about more things and more clear on the political and ethical importance of feeling certain about those things is that actually, of course, it means that there's a larger body of people than ever to whom I am inclined very strongly to recommend my book. Meaning, obviously, I wish, as ever, that people who disagreed with me were able to adopt these positions of sincerely questioning themselves, not the cynical, I'm just asking questions that you're referring to, but sincerely question why they believe what they do and the motives of people who are persuading them to do that and the company they're keeping and how they came to hold those beliefs. Of course, I wish that that people held that. And it feels, of course, deeply hypocritical to feel that my own hold on that is loosening exactly at the moment that I want other people to embrace it further. And yet to your point, I think that is kind of the plight of our current political moment, because it does feel more important to me right now to stand up for what I believe than to question those beliefs.
Well, in a way, I feel like it makes the book much more important and relevant, particularly if you're anyone with any sort of public platform or in some sort of knowledge business, because as a journalist, let's say, the stakes of what you're doing have never been higher. And so the tendency to see it as some sort of crusade or sort of moral act also makes you, more likely to get it really wrong about certain things or to reject potentially disconfirming information. And so in a sense, like, you need that intellectual humility and self-awareness more than ever, so you know what to really be certain about and then what to question. And obviously, I think that's what's so tricky. Yeah, it's like, let's say in a pandemic, when people are sort of trying to gaslight or sow disinformation about some pretty well-established things. How do you separate those pretty well-established things with those new things that are coming out that it's impossible for it to have like whether it's a new variant or, update, like, let's say, like the mask debate is such an interesting one, right? Because it's like, first off, they were late. They told us not to use masks, and maybe that was like there was a political reason for that. Then they told us to use masks, and then there was the logistical constraint of like what kind of masks were available, and then there was, as the variants changed, the efficacy of them changes through time. And so how do you maintain a general consistent belief in something that the studies seem to largely support, but then also be flexible inside of it, like as to what kind of mask works, how effective it is under this variant or that variant? It's like, this is like graduate level stuff that we are asking people who maybe don't even have a high school education to wrap their heads around.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly complex. And, I certainly think you're right that actually it is a moment that calls on us to think a lot about I stand by this sense of actually right now we need to be standing up for our beliefs, but those are, as you said, kind of the core tenets, the really indispensable things without which we kind of lose our moral ground floor. But obviously, above and beyond that, there's we are confronted with endless information right now, and the struggle to make sense of what's accurate and what's useful. And sometimes those things are kind of pitted against each other in unfortunate ways. And the mask situation is a great example. I do think it's been a long, strange road through the pandemic. And I think part of, and again, here's a place where I really stand by the book, as the kind of illiberalism has crept into our culture and our politics farther and deeper, I do think there's been a kind of liberal closing of ranks, and there do become certain things you're not supposed to question, and certain things you just sort of obviously nod your head along with. And I think that's dangerous as well, and I think you're absolutely right to think that something political was happening when we were initially told not to wear masks. And I'm upset about it to this day. I think it cost a lot of lives, to be honest.
Totally.
And I don't think it was done in sincerity. I think it was done in the face of a very complicated moment in the pandemic. And I don't think anyone was out to kill anyone, but I certainly don't think it was, science and public health, at their finest. And it continues to be really complicated that way. Should elementary school kids be wearing masks? Should we be closing schools? Should we be keeping kids out for 10 days at a time to figure out, whether they're actually contagious or not? I mean, these are really, really hard questions. And it is interesting, there's a lot of, as ever, there's a lot of passion on both sides of them, sometimes unmoored from what feels to me like both the facts of the matter and the authentic complexity of it, because I think when you engage with the authentic complexity has a wonderful way of being a kind of cooling function on passion, in a good way. I think that the minute you understand, this is actually quite complicated, you can continue to advocate for what you believe, of course, but I think it's harder to dismiss out of hand those who disagree with you.
It's almost like also there's this kind of like intellectual or epistemological nihilism where they would go like, because we were just talking about with mass, where it's like, there's this and there's this and there's this and there's this. So because all that is confusing or somewhat contradictory, nothing works. We know nothing, right? And so it's almost this tendency, and this is, I think, where gaslighting comes in, where people, I think the Russians have a name for this tactic too, like where if the Russians want to like compromise a politician, or they want to, let's say they want to invade Crimea, they're like, let's just flood the zone with information, right? Let's just throw so much like maybe he's guilty of this, maybe she's guilty of that, maybe what is happening in this picture, who knows? What about this lie that they told? And then all of a sudden you're like, I don't know anything. And then this goes to your point about certainty. Because I can't be certain about it, I'll just throw up my hands.
Yeah.
And just because something is confusing doesn't mean you can't make educated guesses, or there aren't sort of safe enough assumptions you can make. And so I think that's really also what's tricky is it's like we're so confused. There's so much information, and then so many people acting in bad faith to muddy the waters even further. People are just like, well, I don't know, so I'm just going to go with whatever inconveniences me less.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess my feeling about this is I have an instinctive dislike of the throw up your hands response. And yet I have a lot of sympathy. And I do, that's the moment where I feel like actually the useful expenditure of time is not in trying to help 10 million separate people work their way through the zone of misinformation. It's in dealing with the bad actors, right? Dealing with the bad faith and trying to kind of right the civic ship, because you will never kind of person by person, I don't think, be able to solve this problem. I think it really is a problem that is being deliberately perpetrated on a mass scale, and it's the deliberate sowers of the information that need to be addressed. Not, which is not to say abandon the recipients of the misinformation and abandon those who have just concluded it's easiest to throw up their hands and assume some kind of semi-skeptical stance about 100% of things, rather than, threading their way through this kind of complicated maze of information. But I think you have to go after the misinformation itself.
I do too. I wrote about this in my first book, which is what I'd read your book for. And actually, as it happens, Upton Sinclair wrote this expose of journalism in the 1900s, right after he wrote The Jungle. And he was sort of talking about, you basically just information, just like the food system or the environment or whatever, is a public good, right? It's owned by private companies, but it's the public sphere. And when you have people who are poisoning it or abusing their rights to that parkland or idea or water or whatever it is, you have to stop that because it ruins it for everyone. And I do think we have people who are effectively poisoning the aquifer that we all drink from. And some of us have the education or just frankly the free time to figure things out, to do our own research in the actual sense of what that phrase means. And then other of us, because we're old, because we don't even have a computer. We just read stuff on Facebook when we're, working our hourly job at a cash register. it's impossible for us to sort through that. And those are the people who I think get poisoned the most by these bad actors.
Yeah, I mean, I think that metaphor of poisoning the intellectual aquifer is exactly right. And obviously it's been a really long, slow, often unsuccessful battle to go after even the people poisoning the literal aquifer. So it's not that I have high hopes of this turning around quickly, but I think it's where we have to direct our collective attention.
Yeah, that's right. And then I think, again, to go to your point, you look at the existential dread of like a tsunami. What do you do? It's like, go help one person, right?
Yeah.
Like go help one, your aunt who really was just asking questions or was confused. Just call her up and go, look, let me walk you through this, because I'm going to stop one person from propagating it. You know what I mean? I think all we can do is really start at that like super small level.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I'll qualify what I said. I think absolutely we have to figure out how to kind of stop the poisoners of the aquifer, but it doesn't mean that we should let people around us just keep drinking from it willy-nilly,
Yes,
And
yes.
It's interesting, in my new book, I write some about my family, well, my family of origin, but also the family that I married into, and they're very different. And I have married into not my kind of immediate, certainly not my partner, not my immediate in-laws, but I've married into a broader family and a broader community of people. And I now, in fact, live in a part of the world where my friends and neighbors and
where do you live?
Community members. I live on the Eastern Shore of Maryland.
Okay.
So if you don't know anything about the Eastern Shore of Maryland, which there's no reason you would, I didn't before I moved down here, but it's the part of Maryland that really reminds you that all of Maryland is south of the Mason-Dixon line. It's much more identified culturally and politically with the South than with the North. Parts of it have become very, very affluent in the last few decades, but it's historically an agricultural and a kind of water-based economy. It's very rural and working class, and it's you're absolutely right about having the hard conversations. We have very dear family members, my partner and I, who we've had to just sit down and say, no, the vaccines aren't a hoax. Yes, the virus is real. Here's why you can't come meet our baby until or unless you get vaccinated and wear a mask. And you're absolutely right. I mean, those feel important and have in some cases been persuasive, and that's very heartening to me, and I don't think we can abandon those kinds of one-on-one conversations at all. But they're tough, and I admire, it's interesting, I regard my partner as vastly kind of morally braver than I am. And, she literally talked our neighbors into taking down the Confederate flag in front of their house, which I thought was a fool's errand, to be perfectly honest.
Sure.
I mean, that's a great example. Like I wrote off someone I shouldn't have written off, and in fact, they did. First, they just moved it to the backyard, but that actually felt like an improvement. And then it came down entirely. And it was a little reminder of, right, actually, we do have to have the hard conversations, and we do have to share our values out loud, because how else are we ever going to make them compelling and help them to spread?
Well, and that obligation, obviously, we're all neighbors, so we all have that, but it's commensurate to what you have access to as part of your profession. Like I was reading Michael Lewis's book on the pandemic, which is really good, The Premonition. And I didn't know that the Priscilla Zuckerberg, the Chan Zuckerberg Institute funded a lot of the really early pandemic research that probably saved tens of or hundreds of thousands of lives. So you're like, oh, this is great. Here they are. They're very wealthy. They're spending money on this thing to start this pandemic. And then you're like, but also this guy wakes up every day and goes to work at a place that could actively change, the way this information is being spread. But then sort of goes, of course, we have no ability to do that. So it's always interesting, I think, too, how we decide to see what like our obligations are. It's having the tough conversations with your neighbor, and then it's also like, well, what power or influence do you have in society? And do you take those steps there too, I think?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that it's It's very easy to underestimate our power and influence in society.
Yeah.
And I say that specifically to kind of indict my own class and background. I think it's, obviously a lot of people have a lot more money and resources than they think they do. You wish you were Zuckerberg, but you might not be the 1%, but you're probably the 10%. And, you could be doing something in all kinds of ways. But also, I think kind of across the board, I mean, I'm awed and inspired over and over again by people who have vastly less than I do and do vastly more. In fact, I take that to be kind of paradigmatic in the sense that some of the people I know who actually help their neighbors and families the most and actually have committed most to genuine social change actually have very little and everything to lose. So I do think we're often a little prone to underestimating our power, which I get, right? It's very hard to feel powerful in the face of these incredibly sweeping forces. On the other hand, and it's discouraging to feel powerful and then be reminded a million times a day that you aren't in all kinds of ways. On the other hand, it does actually seem ultimately better, not only practically, but also emotionally than feeling impotent.
Well, so how does what we're talking about intersect with, I was fascinated with the piece you wrote on the Underground Railroad, which is this sort of become part of the American, not revisionist history, but as we look at this dark, terrible moment in American history, we also look for like bright spots or, things we can take as inspiring. And you were sort of saying that the Underground Railroad, not that it wasn't real and not that the people who were involved in it weren't incredibly heroic, but it's almost a way of kind of like patting ourselves on the back or fooling ourselves about how like change and what our obligations to each other, where that actually is.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, so I said I live on the eastern shore of Maryland, and one really remarkable thing about the eastern shore of Maryland is it gave us, I think, two of the greatest American patriots of all time. It gave us Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass. So I've thought a lot about the Underground Railroad. Yeah. I live near various kind of obviously early Southern stops on it, but yeah, I mean, look, on the one hand, I think it's incredibly wonderful that we, as a culture, more and more identify with our best histories and our best stories and our bravest acts. And there's a part of me that takes heart in the desire of everyone to believe that, grandma's house was on the Underground Railroad, or, great grandpa participated in it, or all this, the kind of claiming of it. Because I think it's a beautiful thing. It suggests we want to be on the side of the angels, right? We want to be on the side of freedom and liberation. And we want to feel, once history has shown us the way, we want to feel that we always would have known it. And I admire and want to nurture in all of us the impulse to be aligned with what we regard as good and right. What's very tricky, of course, is that, I mean, first of all, look, just as a kind of practical matter, the Underground Railway was a very small collection of extraordinarily brave individuals, many of them African American, and not just the kind of white folks along the way, who I think have by and large gotten a lot more, other than Harriet Tubman, have gotten a lot more attention. But more than the kind of overblown sense of how large the phenomenon was, and thus the sense that everyone could kind of claim a piece of it, which is universal, I should say. I mean, everyone in France thinks their relatives were part of the French Resistance, right?
I was just gonna mention that it's like less than 5. It's like the country is literally overrun by the Nazis, and less than 5% of the population was like, I object. I'm going to do something about this.
Yeah. But, it's troubling to me because, right. So the exact same thing was true here, right? I mean, slavery was not sustained in place for as long as it was by, a handful of vicious individuals. It was an incredibly widespread and institutionalized system. And it was aided and abetted enormously by the North, which often likes to take a moral pass for it these days. And, I guess what's troubling to me is, if you think that you would have been a part of the Underground Railroad, look around today and tell me, what's the unbelievably brave, in fact, livelihood risking, life risking thing you are doing on behalf of what you believe to be right. Because, if you're not doing that, you would not have been a part of the Underground Railroad. It's one of the scariest things you possibly could have done, right? One of the riskiest things you possibly could have done. And as ever, very few people have that kind of moral courage. And I think it's I think on the good side, I think it's a beautiful thing to aspire to be our best selves. But I think it has to come hand in hand with the reckoning of it doesn't really matter who you think you would have been. What matters is who are you, and what are you actually
today
doing with your life? Who are you today, right? What are you doing with your life?
Yeah, that is right. It's easy to get in this debate over what was right and wrong 200 years ago or whatever. And then you're like, but where your socks were made and you bought them because they were cheaper than the alternative that was made differently. Right.
Well, also, never mind 200 years ago, 50 years ago, right? The stats on who actually supported the civil rights movement are horrifying. The vast majority of white Americans were gravely troubled by the civil rights movement. They disapproved of the Freedom Riders. They disapproved of Martin Luther King. It is a great act of retroactive revision that has claimed this, even for some of us, tragically not for all of us, as an obvious right and as the destined course of American history. Would that it were so. But again, it took the passage of time and the clear sense of actually, no, you didn't want to be on the side of Wallace and the police dogs. That's not where any of us, that's not where hopefully most of us want to stand today, but it certainly wasn't a widespread belief at the time. And that's just, again, it's 50, 60 years ago.
Yeah. Or even, I remember when they passed Prop 8 in California, right? That was in 2008. That was 14 years ago. And you're just like, oh yeah, people, it's not, because I think what's so interesting about it is we tell ourselves that a lot of the injustices of the past were acts of indifference, but they were also overt acts, right? It wasn't gay marriage was illegal in California and people had to be activated to change it. It was actually the opposite. I think that's what's so interesting about these forces is that it's not even a defensive sort of conservative energy. I don't mean that in the political sense. I mean that in the preserving of the status quo. It's often an aggressive outward energy. The myth we tell ourselves about the Civil War is that slavery was just this thing that always existed. No, slavery was an aggressive, expansive power that was attempting not just to be what it was, but to dominate everything. Lincoln doesn't even have to campaign on Lincoln's transgressive act wasn't the eradication of slavery. It was just no more. Let's not let it be bigger than it is. And so I think so overwhelming, whether we're talking about some of the pandemic stuff or some of these civil rights issues, is that the mob isn't just this thing resisting change, but often driving change. Or do you know what I mean? That it's this overwhelming force that we get caught up in. And I think that dark energy is it's ever present and it moves from issue to issue. And you got to ask yourself, are you in it or are you resisting it?
Yeah. Believe me, it's interesting you bring up Prop 8 and gay marriage and gay rights in general. I think about it all the time. I am gay married, and it's funny, this new book of mine, a part of it, a full third of it is basically a love story. It's about, it's about the families that make us, but it's also about the families that we make. And I have thought a lot about how remarkable it is that I could write a book like this right now. And that in fact, it is by and large, and certainly in the kind of circles that are talking about books and buying books, it's not even being received somehow miraculously. It's no longer even being received as a lesbian memoir. It's a love story, which it is, and and a grief story and many other things. But I'm really mindful of how tenuous that situation is. How recently it was won. I mean, I'm shocked all the time and heartened in good ways by when I despair about political change, I think about gay rights, right? Because actually they happen with shocking speed, which is all the more amazing because you're right to point out that it was never just a kind of new right we carved out and gained. There was and remains a very active, very vituperative in that case, and in most cases, very powerful force trying to oppose it, and I have no illusions that couldn't resurge at any point in time. I mean, we're looking at a moment, obviously, when another very hard fought right, the right of a woman to control the most fundamental choices about her body and her future, seems extraordinarily tenuous and very likely to be rolled back and to be fought all over again. So, yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, for many of us, these are not. For some people, there is a kind of remove to these rights, and we want to live in the kind of country that regards all of its citizens as equal, or that cherishes voting rights and civil rights, or that lets anyone marry, lets anyone control their body when it comes to private and fundamental decisions. But for a lot of people, it's not about what kind of country you want to live in. It's can you vote? It's,
Sure.
can you marry? Can you feel, I mentioned when we were just chatting at the beginning, I have this beautiful 5-month-old daughter. Can I feel absolutely certain that no one is going to have the power to ever take her away from me or deny the fact that I'm her mom? It's a, I
right. The
feel
idea that
very lucky
just a few years ago, like you might not have been able to be on the same healthcare plan. Like how incomprehensibly banal that is and outwardly evil at the same time.
Or on the birth certificate, which,
Right.
is
Yes.
in some ways, in a kind of practical day to day or really like month by month, considering how we pay the bills, like it's less important in a certain sense to be on the birth certificate. But I can tell you, having been there in the hospital, it's not emotionally less important. It's not psychologically less important to feel like from minute one, I was this baby's mother. These are hard fought rights. And it is, I guess I feel so grateful. I really do feel like I've lived at a very fortunate time in all kinds of ways. And now that I feel a little bit less that way, it's galvanizing. I feel like I owe it to my daughter and to others to help them feel that they lived in fortunate times as well.
Well, maybe there's that sort of myth at the end of the Cold War that we were at the end of history and that sort of everything was heading not in a progressive direction, again, politically, but that we were these sort of fundamental battles over right and wrong, or rights, in inherent inalienable rights, were sort of over. And then it's like, no, not even close, not even close. And that one has a sort of moral obligation to participate in that. Because if you've ever met a single person who these things affect, you realize these aren't just like abstract markers in a culture war, but things that affect like actual human beings. When you meet someone who, again, you can have whatever squeamish or thoughts you want to have about, say, like pro-life or pro-choice, and then like meet someone who was not able to get an abortion, that felt, they need, like, just feel the weight of that, and it suddenly becomes not such a black and white thing.
Yeah, I mean, we talked earlier about the importance of conversations with individuals, and I do think a deep and tragic disconnect in our culture is the way we are, I think, quite deliberately separated from people of other backgrounds, people of other means, people of other life experiences in all kinds of ways. And it is, it's a corrosive force. It's hard to understand poverty if you have never lived anywhere near poverty. It's hard to understand the exigencies of healthcare if you've never had to worry about whether you yourself have, and maybe you're frustrated by, you know, Blue Cross Blue Shield or whatever, because who isn't, but you've never had to contend with what it's like to actually not get healthcare, or to over and over and over again get inferior healthcare. You know, I do think, you know, it's a strange thing. Millions of people in this country live in precarity and in poverty and without access to healthcare and without access to basic civil rights in certain kinds of ways that should never apply in the first world. And yet somehow millions of the rest of us manage to not ever actually deeply engage with that as a reality.
Yes, right. And I think, to go back to your point about understanding history, I think to understand, you know, that picture of those people screaming at Ruby Bridges or whatever. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, to realize that Ruby Bridges is like 65 years old right now, right? If you want to understand how recent it is. Sure. But like when you get like I remember reading about the civil rights movement, that there was Kennedy is in the middle of arguing whether it's I forget which governor it is, but let's say Mississippi or Alabama. He goes, he suddenly understands the Civil War from a different perspective. He's like, oh, this is that energy. He's like, obviously we're not fighting about literal slavery anymore, but this is that energy that Lincoln was dealing with and that Grant was dealing. This is that energy. And I think, you know, my experience, you know, dealing with some of that sort of dark internet energy in the last couple of years has then informed how I understand that picture of those people screaming at that child. You go, oh, this makes sense to me. Like, not that it's right, but you're like, I see I know I have touched that energy, you know, in a modern context. And it's
terrifying is what it is. Yeah. I mean, I think it's very, very scary to confront what you're calling that dark energy, which, to be honest, I think is often truly hatred in a way that's so uncomfortable to confront. And, you know, I said part of this new book is a love story. Part of it is also kind of an elegy to my father, who died in 2016. And my dad was a refugee to this country. He was born in Tel Aviv back when it was still part of Palestine, to a Polish mother who, this is my grandmother, my maternal grandmother. She had 12 siblings, and 11 of the 12 of them and her parents all died in Auschwitz. And my family on that side, you know, was kind of kicked around the globe by the combined forces of poverty and genocide and political instability, until my dad finally wound up in Detroit as a very young teenager, 12, 13. And I grew up with a sense of, this is real in the world, right? The desire to literally exterminate a people. This exists, you know, and it's a terrible thing to have to confront as a child or as anyone. I mean, I think a lot about actually how on earth I'm ever going to teach my incredibly cheerful, precious, beautiful little daughter about truths like these, because they're terrifying.
About the darkness.
Really are. About the darkness. And yet it's there, and it's ultimately much scarier, certainly as a species, if not as individuals, if we fail to confront it. And, you know, it's shocking to me every time it incarnates itself in some new form or in some old form. You know, I mean, anti-Semitism is obviously on the rise globally. I slightly optimistically, I don't generally believe that progress is, you know, irreversible and history always marches forward towards better times. But I thought slightly that the days of widespread vituperative anti-queer energy was largely behind us. And I've been proven wrong about that too. Although again, I feel grateful every day that it's not the kind of real animosity and violence that it once was. But yeah, you know, in all of these forms, we are, you know, the present reminds us every day that it's actually a part of history and that we're living through it. And it rattles its very terrifying chains in our faces all the time. And I think, you know, I guess we should embrace the part of ourselves that thinks we would be part of the Underground Railroad, because God knows we need as many people as we can to stand up and say, I want to be on the right side this time.
Have you read Cormac McCarthy's The Road?
Funny you should ask. So I have a policy with respect to Cormac McCarthy. I read one novel every 10 years because I swear to you, that's like as much as I can take. I'm a huge admirer, actually. I really am. I think he's incredibly gifted, and both literarily, I think he writes incredible sentences, and also kind of as a visionary, although let's all hope his vision is not the only one. But no, I most recently read Blood Meridian, and I'm only like 2.5 years into my 10-year stint, which I'm slightly exaggerating about, but somehow I'm the last person in America not to have read The Road, even though I understand exactly why I should.
I think I reread it at the beginning of the pandemic, which was both a good and a terrible idea, because I'd read it before I had kids.
It was much back in the literary news at the beginning of the pandemic. Yes.
Yeah, and I remember I went into my son's room when he was asleep, and I just sort of broke down weeping.
Oh gosh.
But like, in the book he talks about. And obviously we talk about dark energy, that's the culmination of the dark energy that sort of destroys the world. But the beautiful sort of theme in the book is they talk about carrying the fire being like, are you one of the good guys or are you one of the bad guys? And I suppose that the myth we tell ourselves about the Underground Railroad, if there's any productive part to it, it's the idea that like they were carrying the fire just as, the insert whatever heroic group from whatever generation that you want to celebrate. Mm-hmm. They were carrying the fire just as the freedom riders were carrying the fire, just as the gay rights activists were carrying the fire, just as, the scientists who invent the vaccine are carrying the fire, that it's all sort of part of this, procession of torches towards keeping that goodness alive despite the darkness. And there's something, I do think there's something about having kids that reminds you not just of the necessity of that, but your obligation as a parent to light that within them, or to not extinguish it within them, because that's the only hope for humanity.
Yeah, I mean, it's been much on my mind, both because of my daughter and because I really did try to wrestle in this new book with how we live with the inevitability of loss and grief, mm-hmm. and with suffering and devastation of all kinds on every scale, tsunamis, genocides, pandemics, as well as the kind of private devastations of losing people we love. And I kind of landed on the place of believing in the importance of caretaking, of being the watchmen and the watchwomen of our communities and of our generations, because it's all we can do, is try to protect those around us and the world around us, and kind of pass it along in the best condition we can. But it's it's painful. It's sad and scary at various times. And
well, I was going to ask you about grief, because that is a theme in the new book. And then, of course, collectively, America is experiencing, and probably no one wants to put our finger on that as the, sort of driving force. But I feel like grief is the explanation for so much of the darkness we're seeing, whether it's grief from the destruction of the opioid crisis, whether it's grief from the collapse of certain industries, collapse of, in some ways, our image about ourselves, and then, of course, the literal devastation of the pandemic. It strikes me as grief is both a very personal and loving emotion, but it also seems like it can manifest itself in a toxic way also.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, yes, I have spent a lot of the last, call it 5 years now, thinking about grief. The book is called Lost and Found, and the whole first part, Lost, is very explicitly about grief. And to be honest, it then kind of runs continuously as a theme through the rest of it in various ways. And, it's interesting. I think you're diagnostically right. I think we are a grieving society right now. I think that's been wildly exacerbated and actually also made wildly, tragically literal in the pandemic. But I think you're right that was true beforehand. We have this language of deaths of despair, and I think there is a lot of despair in our culture right now. I think, yes, collapse of industries, yes, opioid crisis. I think also the unraveling of a lot of institutions that kept people supported and kept them in a community, or at least under someone's watchful eye, and I don't want to suggest that was a paradisical time either. There were real problems to living under the close scrutiny of one another. And yet I do think that we have frayed apart in all kinds of ways and left ourselves exposed to terrible grief. And the thing about grief is it's very lonely. It's lonely even when you're lucky, like me, right? I was lucky in every way in the kind of grief I'm documenting in the book. As I make a very strong point of making it clear that my father's death was not a tragedy. It was incredibly sad to me. He was an amazing person, but he was 74 years old. He had a remarkable life and died, I hope, at peace and certainly surrounded by the people he loved. So it was, basically a good death insofar as there is such a thing. But what's shocking, of course, is that even with all of that going for him, and even with everything I have going for me, which is every imaginable kind of privilege and comfort, a partner, a great job, financial resources, healthcare, to your point, it was still unmooring and devastating. And it's tough to cope with grief, and tougher with every single resource you take away, a sibling, a partner, a way to pay your next bill, it becomes, it magnifies its force. It will take over any part of your life that you allow it to. And it is lonely, even if many other people are mourning in the same way you are, it's a very private experience, and it's not shared. And, I think that as a culture, it's one thing to talk about what to do about a private grief, and there's a huge proliferation of books and podcasts and therapists and so on that will help you navigate the loss of someone you love, down to every level of specificity. If you lost a sibling, if you lost a partner, if you lost a parent, all of which I think is wonderful, and I'm not at all disparaging it. I think it's great that we're trying to support people in these ways, but there's very little written about what to do about just the problem of loss in general. About an unmoored culture, about what happens when you lose your father, but also your job, or when your community is undone by some kind of mass event, like an earthquake or like a tsunami. We don't have good means for dealing with that kind of grief, and you often see a kind of grief coming together in the face of real crisis, which is a beautiful thing. We saw it when everyone in New York, cheered first responders at 7:00 every day. And there was this sense of kind of resurgent faith in humanity. We love each other, we support each other. And then here we are, 2 years into a pandemic, and our first responders are woefully underpaid, woefully exposed to the pandemic, yelled at and screamed at by the people they're trying to take care of. We haven't, I don't think, provided the kind of durable love and care, but also just practical resources to help one another out of the grief of the pandemic. And again, that's just the pandemic. That's before we get to the kinds of issues you're raising, which were the I think, sort of fissures and neglect in our society that made so much pre-existing grief flow into the pandemic and become very obvious as it kind of fractured us apart.
I think that's right. Slightly more cheerful note as we wrap up. I was reading about your sister, who's a childhood development expert, right?
Yes.
How is having that in the family shaped your thinking about raising, is it son or daughter? How have you thought about raising your kid in light of the wealth of knowledge you have access to, or do you just tune it out entirely?
That is such a funny question. Yes, my sister is a professor of cognitive science at MIT. She's brilliant and incredible with kids. Actually coming to visit again pretty soon because she can't stay away from her little niece, much to my delight. Do I think about it? I mean, I guess occasionally I've called my sister and said, like, you know, can you explain why my daughter is like absolutely obsessed with this like insane stuffed peacock someone gave us that I was about to donate, but now is like, she loves it so much we joke that it's her babysitter because she'll stare at him for 20 hours. So I've occasionally reached out to her about things like that. But to be honest, mostly what I value in my sister is, and I think this is probably why she got into the field, not a consequence of her being in the field. She just loves kids and she's amazing with them. So mostly I think of her in her personal capacity as my sister and my baby's aunt more than I do as in her scientific capacity. Although I also find the kind of unfurling of a consciousness and the unfurling of a self to be just the most fascinating thing to watch in the whole world. So I do have all kinds of questions about it. And I'm sure that as my daughter gets older, I will pester my sister about them relentlessly.
It does feel, you were talking in your New York Times piece about, so we have the grief of what we've lost, but one of the things we can focus on is what we gain in what we go through. And it struck me at some point, I've traveled a little bit now for some stuff, and then it seemed like it's closed again. Like you, it always seems like right as a book is about to come out, that's when suddenly all the things get closed down again. But I realized that I did 500 consecutive bedtimes, like in person, and realizing that I'll probably never get that again in my life. And probably had never, even before I had kids, I'd never gone 500 days without getting on an airplane, probably in my whole life. Right. And just it's like inside the trauma and the loss of all of it, there is also the time that we've gotten that you ordinarily would be on a plane away from your kid not there, because work is also important. And now you've got to do it in a different way.
Yeah. I mean, look, there's a reason I landed on this like very everyday title, Lost and Found, for this book. It's incredible what we discover sometimes without even knowing it was missing from our lives. You know, you said this beautiful thing before we got on that you can't even understand why you weren't doing this before. And, and it's true, you know, I mean, the pandemic has been full of losses of every kind, including ones pertaining to my daughter. You know, I, like parents everywhere, I have thought a lot about what is and isn't safe, you know, to what extent she can, you know, go play at her aunt's house, or, you know, is it safe for my elderly mother to get on an airplane and come visit? And how do I keep her safe and the baby safe? And, you know, there's been a lot of confusion and anxiety around it all, but you're absolutely right that also I'm at her side all the time, and I put her to bed every night, and I'm there when she wakes up every morning. And it does feel like a tremendous gift. And, you know, for good or ill, I think a lot of what is very difficult in life is often conjoined to something incredibly beautiful, or failing that, incredibly meaningful. And conversely, much of what we love and cherish most in life reminds us of how fragile it is and how precious it is. So I do think we're always living with both at once.
Yeah, that's what I found to be, as you said, it's a very simple title, but there is a profundity to it, because what you lose presents often the opportunity to find something else. And, you know, or at the very least, what did you learn from what you lost, whether it was gratitude or appreciation or whatever. It is, even just like, okay, sure. We haven't been able to do these things. We also haven't gotten sick as a family in 2 years, you know, which as you know, is just like a reality of having kids. And it's like, oh my God, this is so nice. Like, could it be like this all the time? You know, we got a cold a couple months ago, and it was just like, this is terrible. We used to do this all the time. Like once a month, we all just collectively accepted that the downside of working in an office or going to daycare was that we we all were debilitated with the flu once every 30 days. I mean, this is madness.
Yeah, I mean, I am slightly starting to wonder how, at what point does it become actually bad for my baby that she hasn't had a cold yet? But I'm not quite motivated to go out and, expose us to heaven knows what yet to put an end to that situation. But I hear you.
Yeah, like I even like to go to the mask thing. It was like, I remember a couple of years ago, I got mono probably on an airplane, and I would just come in from the disgusting airport around these disgusting strangers and just breathe all over these people without a thought to how one's actions affect anyone else. And so I have thought about I do hope for some of us, clearly not all of us, but one of the upsides, one of the things we should find from this is a greater consideration for like how our choices affect other people, especially kids.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's so complicated because on the one hand, I mourn the era in which we all just mingled with one another on the subway, at daycare, wherever it may be, without feeling like a danger to one another. To me, that's been one of the real costs of the pandemic, is the sense that other people are somehow imperiling us, because I think that's a very grim and dangerous place to inhabit.
Sure. No, it's literally antisocial.
It is literally antisocial, right? And yet, do I share your sense that that there are lessons to be gleaned from how we've all had to live these last couple of years? Yeah, absolutely. I think that it was fascinating to watch people make happen in 3 months what allegedly just was impossible. It's been very snowy. Yes. As I'm sure you heard, it's like, there's kind of a snowstorm all up and down the East Coast. And my sister-in-law is a special ed teacher, and they had a snow day yesterday. Today. Sorry. It's other pandemic problem. I've lost track of time entirely. They had a snow day today. Yes. But
that's also having a 5-month-old though.
That's also having a 5-month-old for sure. Actually, I spend a lot of time trying to figure out what's like parenthood and what's the pandemic. It is sometimes unclear. But they had a snow day. It wasn't safe to get into school. But you know what? They did not lose another day of instruction, because this time they sent the kids home with the computers they'd been learning on anyway. Which, is it ideal? No. But do you want kids to lose more learning time after all this time? No. So, there is. I do think there are kinds of modifications to society, some of them for the worse, but some of them for the better. And I hope the ones for the better do emerge intact out of this.
Yeah, lost and found. It's beautiful how that works out.
Yeah, beautiful is where I hope we can kind of ultimately sit with it. I know it's many more things than that, and I never want to diminish the kind of grief we've all been through these last couple of years, not to mention just the kind of grief life doles out in general. But I try to inhabit the posture of feeling profoundly lucky to be here, kind of no matter what's happening, and to recognizing that the grief is actually connected to my abundant love of people and of this planet and of the cosmos and the human experience writ large. So, I like to think I land on beauty and joy at the end of the day.
Well, and then, to go to your point about your relatives, obviously, no one chooses to go through those terrible events, but then, because people are resilient, those events change and transform them in a way that, again, they would never have chosen and shouldn't have to go through. But, when you talk to, when I would talk to relatives who fought in World War II or lived through the Depression, it wasn't it was the worst thing that ever happened. My life was never the same. Everything was meaningless and awful afterwards, right? These events shaped who they became and what they taught to their children and to their grandchildren. And, hopefully, I think this idea that this was like purely bad or purely a deprivation for children strikes me as also the wrong way to think about it, because it was also an opportunity to teach them so many things, provided, you didn't get sucked into the dark energy we were talking about. But your children could also emerge from this, hopefully, better and stronger and wiser and more connected, just as we can hopefully emerge from it that way.
Yeah. I mean, I tread lightly always with the notion that our suffering will somehow be redeemed, which I think is, partly from growing up with a grandmother who had endured the kind of suffering that is actually irredeemable, and that in every possible respect impoverished her life rather than making it deeper or more meaningful. So I'm mindful it's easy to be glib on that theme, and yet it's a mistake to let go of that theme entirely, because of course, short of that scale of tragedy, obviously we learn from our pain and our suffering and our loss, and it's right and beautiful. We want to try to make it something other than pain, and that takes our own agency and our own work to make it matter to our lives, and to acquire some kind of value or something that we can pass on or use to just kind of do better in whatever sense in our day-to-day life. So yeah, I absolutely think that our losses do sometimes teach us incredibly valuable lessons. It's never not complicated. Certainly, I think the generation of school children who lost so much socially and intellectually these last couple of years, and especially those who were already, in a precarious place with respect to schooling, whether by, how well supported their schools were, or by whatever special learning needs they themselves had. It's not been pretty, and they deserved better. But I know what you mean. We all know people or know of people who were of the last generation of pandemic. Much has been written about the 1918 flu. I guess we don't really all know people from then, but or the greatest generation of this kind of thing. Obviously there is a narrative that is about strength and resilience and redemption. And as I said, it's easy to lean too hard on that, or to kind of facilely decide like, oh, well, it's all what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, right? Which I don't actually think is necessarily the case.
Sometimes it just grievously wounds you.
Yeah, exactly. But there's a reason I got so interested in exploring the category of loss, right? Because I do think that our large losses can teach us about our small ones, and our small ones can teach us about our large ones, and all of them in some ways can teach us, even when the lessons are painful and not strictly speaking redemptive, they can teach us a lot about what it means to be human, because that is one of the very fundamental conditions of being human, is you're going to lose a lot of things, including in the end your life. And you do have to figure out how to live with that, and how to live meaningfully with that.
Well, yeah, it's like one of the inevitability of suffering in human life has created our uniquely human ability to, if not make that event meaningful, derive some meaning from those experiences. And in fact, that's kind of all we can do, given how powerless we are over, most of what happens to us.
Yeah, exactly. And also, loss, although inevitable and omnipresent, is seldom, I should not say seldom, but it is certainly not always an unmixed experience or the dominant experience, right? I mean, there are, from my last book, right? I wrote about being wrong. I'm drawn to these abstract categories of human experience,
Yeah.
What's it like to err? That's interesting. Well, loss is an abstract category of human experience. We all lose endless things, an insane range of things, car keys, elections, fathers. But we also find a really strange range of things also,
Sure.
Our car keys back again, but also faith and a sense of self and a career and someone to love, and meaning, and joy. Exactly. And I do like to think that these categories are really intimately related to each other, and that they do help us make sense of, what it means to be alive, and what it means to be mortal in a universe kind of defined by entropy and by things falling apart and leaving us in all kinds of ways. So yeah, I think, you heard me say I err when I can on the side of joy and on the side of meaning, even in these really grievous losses, because I think it's it's kind of the best and only thing we can do.
Well, beautifully said. It was an honor to talk, and thank you so much for sharing your wisdom in these books.
Thank you so much for having me on. It's a total pleasure.